Hello, I'm Kevin Frender with Black Dog LED, and today we're going to discuss how to graft tomatoes. Now, why would you want to graft tomatoes? Well, a lot of the tastiest heirloom type tomatoes out there are bred specifically for their flavor and not necessarily for their disease resistance or their productivity. So it's hard. You can choose between tomato varieties that are grown for mass greenhouse production, not necessarily for flavor, but for their disease resistance and their productivity, as well as how well they stand up transport on the way to market. Or you can grow the delicate, not necessarily disease resistant, and often in fact very disease prone, but very tasty heirloom type tomatoes. But grafting allows you to have kind of the best of both worlds, in that you can take a plant who was bred specifically not even for edibility, but simply for disease resistance and vigor, and use that as the roots for the plant that you want to grow that has the wonderful taste but may not be as resistant to diseases. This allows you, because it's on a disease-resistant root system, you can plant the tomatoes in a spot where maybe you've had tomatoes before in previous years and there's a disease lingering in the soil, or if there's just simply disease in the soil in your area, you can still plant tomatoes there on roots that are specifically resistant to those diseases and still get the top of the plant that actually produces fruit that you actually want. Plus, because these root stocks, as they're called, the plants that are bred specifically for disease resistance, because they are also bred for vigor, they can impart additional production to heirloom tomato varieties. In my experience, it's literally the difference between, here in Colorado, having a tomato that you're struggling to get 2.5 to 3 feet tall at the end of the season, if it's on its own roots, versus if it's grafted onto a superior disease-resistant and extra vigorous rootstock, having to cut the plant off at 8 feet tall on the 4th of July because there's no point in letting it grow any taller. I can't reach anything above that. So it makes a huge difference in terms of production. Does not really affect the flavor of what you're putting on top. You just get more tomatoes out of the heirloom varieties you want. So there's really no reason not to try grafting, and it's much easier than you might actually realize. There's a couple of things that you will need to do in advance, though, in order to prepare yourself for tomato grafting. One is you're going to need to get specific disease-resistant, extra vigorous tomato rootstock seeds. Now, these are generally in seed catalogs specifically labeled as rootstocks, and they probably even come with a warning that the fruit that they produce is not even necessarily going to be edible. But that's fine. If you do the grafting correctly, they won't ever be able to produce fruit. It's only the plant that you put on top of it that will be producing fruit for you. There's a variety of different kinds out there. There's two different main kinds of rootstocks, or two different categories of rootstocks. Ones that are called generative, and ones that are called vegetative rootstocks. Now, generative rootstocks are generally ones that are bred so that they put all of their energy into flowering and fruiting all at one time. So they have a big flush of tomatoes all at once, but then what they do after that, it probably isn't going to be very good. But generative rootstocks work very well with determinate varieties of tomatoes that are also bred to do that, put all of their energy into one big flush of tomatoes, and then they may produce some after that, but it's not even really worth growing them after they've made their main crop. Vegetative rootstock varieties, on the other hand, are designed for indeterminate tomato varieties that just keep growing more and blooming and fruiting continuously throughout the season. So you want to match the rootstock that you're using up with the variety of tomato you plan on putting on top. So once you've gotten your rootstock seeds and whatever varieties of heirloom tomatoes you want to graft on top, you're going to want to plant those seeds at roughly the same time. Now, this is where every different variety of tomato germinates at slightly different times, and so you may actually want to do a small germination test. Plant some of your rootstock seeds and the variety that you want to plant on top at the same date, and then take note of when they actually germinate so you can figure out, oh, maybe I should have planted the rootstock seed 2 days earlier so that it gets the same size at the same time as what you want to grow on top. Oftentimes the rootstock will grow more vigorously, and so you end up planting those seeds later, but it really does vary from variety to variety. So typically every year I'll do a little germination test. If I'm trying out a new variety of tomato and I don't know how long it takes to get to a certain size, I'll just germinate a few seeds. One generally isn't enough for a good test, but 2 or 3 will give you an idea of when you need to plant them to get them to the ideal size for grafting. And that ideal size for grafting is actually as small as you can get, but after the plants have had at least 1 set, if not 2 sets, of their true leaves. Not the seed leaves or cotyledons, but true leaves. Once they start getting more than 2 sets of true leaves, it's not that you can't graft them, it just gets more difficult, it takes longer, they take longer to recover, so it's easier actually to do it when they're smaller, but again, you have to wait until after they have at least 1 set of true leaves to do it. Other equipment you're going to need is going to be a very sharp knife, or ideally a scalpel, or if you're willing to shell out a few tens of dollars, they actually make specialty grafting tools, such as this one, that actually have little grooves here that line up with a blade at a perfect 45-degree angle, so you can make a perfect 45-degree cut every time. If you're planning on doing a lot of grafting, I highly recommend buying one of these. They come with replaceable blades. So once you've paid for the tool and a set of 20 blades, you're probably good for 20 years worth of grafting, and it's well worth it. It makes it so much faster and easier. But like I said, a sharp tool like a scalpel, if you have a steady hand and make a nice 45-degree cut, that will work as well. The other thing you're going to need are these little tomato grafting clips. So these are made out of silicone, and we can show a close-up here of how they work. It's basically just a little clip that has a silicone hinge on it that is designed to wrap around the stem and keep the scion and the rootstock locked together while they're healing. I just mentioned a new word there. The scion is the plant that you want to put on top, and the rootstock is specifically being used only for its roots. So this little clip actually is what will hold the 2 stems together while they're healing, so that they don't just fall apart on you. For other types of grafting, for woody plants, you often have to wrap it with tape to keep things nice and snug and secure. But when you're dealing with little tiny tomato seedlings, that's almost impossible to do, and these graft clips make it practically foolproof. Now, these are available in many different sizes. If you're doing a lot of grafting, I probably would recommend getting 1.5 and 2 millimeter, possibly 2.5 millimeter sizes. If you need larger graft clips than that, you're probably waiting too long to do your grafting. But different tomatoes grow at different rates, and depending on how perfect you are at choosing the perfect day for when your seedlings are the ideal size, maybe the 1.5 millimeter clips aren't going to be big enough for you all the time, which is why it's helpful to have some of the 2 and 2.5 millimeter clips around as well. These things are relatively inexpensive online, pretty easy to find. So let me get started here explaining how you do the actual grafting. When grafting, you want to make sure and cut the rootstock off beneath the first set of seed leaves or cotyledons, because at the base of each one of these is the first dormant node that the rootstock plant has. If you leave any of those dormant nodes on the rootstock plant, they can actually turn into stems, which may then actually grow the rootstock plant, producing inedible or possibly even poisonous fruit from it. When you're choosing which plants to graft together, you want to get the same size stem, as closely matched as possible for both the rootstock and the scion that you want to put on top. So you want them to be as closely sized as possible. Then you're going to want to test fit one of the grafting clips to see which size grafting clip you actually need. So if I gently put this grafting clip around the stem here, you can see it's not allowing, the stem is holding the grafting clip open just a little bit, but it wasn't difficult to get that grafting clip on there. That is perfect. You don't want the grafting clip to just be loose on the stem. You want it to be holding that in place rather firmly. One important thing to keep in mind when you're grafting tomatoes is you want to make sure to water the tomatoes, the rootstock especially, at an appropriate time. And an appropriate time is not right before you're grafting, because if you water the plant right before you start grafting, when you chop the plant off, it actually is pulling so much water up from the roots still that it's essentially bleeding, and that bleeding sap will actually push the graft apart when you make it. So you want the plants not to be too dry, But you want to have watered them at least 4 hours before you graft, because that gives the plant a chance to suck up all the moisture in the soil that it needs to, so that when you make that cut, it's not going to continue bleeding excessively and actually push the graft apart when you do it. If you're using the grafting tool, you can line up the stem with the convenient notches in the grafting tool to get a perfect 45-degree cut. Now you're going to want to make this cut on the rootstock as high up as possible, but below the cotyledons, as mentioned earlier. So once you're lined up right below the cotyledons, you can simply make the cut. Now you're going to want to throw the top part of the rootstock away. This is now completely useless and worthless. So now that we've made the 45-degree cut on our rootstock, we're going to take our grafting clip and put the open end of the grafting clip at the high side of the 45-degree cut. And you want to put it on so that it's halfway up the grafting clip, as you can see there. The fact that these grafting clips are clear makes it much easier to see what you're actually doing. Once the grafting clip is on the rootstock, you're going to take and make a cut. It doesn't matter whether it's below or above the cotyledons. I generally try and do it below the cotyledons on the scion that you want to graft on top. So we're going to use the same procedure we did with the rootstock. We line up the grooves on the grafting tool with the stem and clip it. One thing to note here is you do want to leave enough of the stem beneath the cotyledons that it will fit in the clip, beneath the cotyledons or any other leaves, so that that stem will actually fit in the clip. Then we're going to take the pointy end of this and put it opposite to the pointy end of the rootstock and slide it in to the grafting clip like this until you can see that they have pushed together and mated together. You don't want to push too hard so that they slide past each other. You want them to be touching, and this is where, again, you can look through the grafting clip to see that you've made a perfect connection. All right, so once you've made your grafts, you want to treat them gingerly because you don't want to shake them too much. The only thing holding these things together at this point is the little silicone grafting clip. Because you did just sever this top, the scion, off of its own roots, it kind of needs to be treated as a cutting at this point with high humidity. So I generally give them a misting of water, but one thing you want to make sure to do is not mist them so much that water starts dripping inside of the grafting clip. Anything that gets inside of that grafting clip is going to hinder the tissues knitting together and healing. So you want to do this very gingerly and just give them a very light misting. Then you're going to want to put them under a humidity dome, as you would with cuttings, and place this in a warm area. Generally, you want to aim for 80 to 85 degrees is ideal. You want them to receive light, but not too much light. Very low light levels, as you would with a cutting. But you want to make sure not to give them 24-hour-a-day light. Tomatoes are never happy with 24-hour-a-day light. They will actually die with extended exposure without any nighttime at all. So I generally recommend 18 to 20 hours a day of light and 6 to 4 hours a day of darkness. After just 4 days of healing, you should be able to start acclimating them to lower humidity again, cracking your humidity dome just a little bit for a couple hours. Come back, check on them. If things appear to be wilting at that point, you might miss them a little bit, put the humidity dome back on, but really want to get them back into normal atmospheric humidity conditions as quickly as possible. Do not stretch the process out for days and days at a time of acclimating them back to normal air. If after 4 to 6 days they have not healed properly and they're wilting when you're taking the humidity dome off, then chances are the graft did not take and you're just going to have to try it again. However, with just a little bit of practice, you can go from, I started out with maybe 50% of my grafts taking, and that's before I found things like the grafting tool, to now with aids like this and a little bit of practice, 98, 99% of all the grafts I take actually succeed the very first time. I also get asked by people all the time, because you treat these things as though they were cuttings for 4 or 5 days, people ask me all the time, well, do I need to apply some sort of rooting hormone? And no, you don't. In fact, that would actually be counterproductive. Your goal is to get the scion, the new top on this plant, to heal its stem and its stem only to the roots and the stem of the rootstock. If you applied some sort of rooting hormone, you're going to encourage this thing to try and grow roots outside of the soil, and that's not what you want. In fact, you don't want this thing, the scion on top, to ever get close to the soil again. You're protecting it from potential diseases in the soil by raising it up out of the ground on this disease-resistant rootstock stem. So again, after 4 days, 5 days if you're not feeling adventurous, but certainly by day 6, you need to have the humidity dome off and just take whatever successes you have out of that and move on. If you keep these things in high humidity for too long, the scion on top will definitely start growing roots out the side of its stem, and that is counterproductive for you and not what you want at all. After 4 to 6 days, you might be tempted to start playing with the grafting clip, but don't touch them. Just leave them on there. As the stem grows, as it heals, it's going to expand and it's actually going to push that grafting clip off exactly when it's ready. So leave the grafting clips alone, treat the plants gingerly until they fully heal, and when they're fully healed, you will find the grafting clip lying on the ground next to it when it's ready to go. So it's been 7 days since I grafted these tomato plants, and I figured we'd do a quick check-in to see how they came out. As you can see, they're out from under their humidity dome. In fact, they came out 3 days ago, and other than one that's getting a little bit wilty, everything else made it through just fine. So again, typically you don't want to leave them in the humidity dome too long because that's going to encourage aerial roots to start forming, and you'll see some of what happened in just 4 days of being in high humidity with these plants. So as you can see, we got aerial roots forming just from being in high humidity, and that's why you really don't want to keep the plants in a humidity dome too long, because these are counterproductive, especially when they're actually coming out and forming on the scion, the part that you grafted on top. Because we don't want these things, the scion that you put on top, to ever get its roots in the soil again, because that will defeat the purpose of having this disease-resistant rootstock down here. So besides all the roots here, you can also see that this particular plant was grafted just slightly too high. It was actually above the cotyledons, or the seed leaves of the rootstock. And so when I cut the top of the rootstock off, you can see where it's actually put out a little side branch here from where the cotyledons used to be. You don't want to have that happen on you, but if it does, you can go ahead and correct it with a little bit of surgery. We don't want to leave this thing on because it's going to start growing much more rapidly than the scion, the part that we grafted on top, and it will eventually overwhelm the whole plant. So we want to discourage the actual rootstock from ever having leaves on it. You only want the scion, the part on top, to have leaves. So I'm just taking a sharp scalpel here and very gently slice that right off. And when I do that, it's probably going to reappear. Sometimes you have to do it 4 or 5 times to get the base rootstock to not have these little side branches coming out again. So I'll have to watch that. Very likely it's going to happen on the other side here as well. And in fact, I can see just a little one forming, so I'm going to do the same surgery on that. And I mentioned before, one of these plants, this one in particular, is a little bit wilty. The top of it is actually not too bad, but this may or may not survive. You can see I grafted 2 other plants in the same pot onto the rootstocks, and they're doing just fine. So if this one doesn't make it, I'll just cull it. Otherwise, I'm going to wait at least a week or so for these to heal up even more before I will try and divide this plant and put each of these in its own pot. You can see the one that is a little bit wilty here actually has a graft that isn't taking very well. Apparently I didn't get the perfect angle on the stems when it went in the grafting clip. And you can see the grafting clip is also pushing off. So again, it's possible when you're grafting that if the graft takes, but it doesn't take well enough, when this grafting clip actually falls off on its own, if the stem doesn't have enough connection between the scion and the rootstock, this whole thing may crack in half and we may lose that plant later. The rest of these, you can see here, this graft is not particularly good. You can see that there's a little bit of the rootstock tip left there, but if you look through the silicone grafting clip on the side, you can actually see that more than half of the stem is in contact and is healed up. Again, don't remove these silicone clips until they fall off on their own. The plant stem, as it grows, will push these off and they'll just pop off on their own, and you'll find them sitting on the ground or in the pot. Because if you do take these off too early and the stem is not healed enough yet, it can just fall apart again. So I would also wait at least a week after you've gotten them out from the humidity dome before transplanting these for the same reason. This is a very fragile connection, and when I do transplant them, I will leave the silicone grafting clips on if they're still on there. Another thing to note is when you are transplanting these, whether into a larger pot or into the ground, you want to keep the soil level down here exactly the same. You never want to bury this deeper in soil, because if you actually have the soil level get up anywhere near where this graft union is, it's possible for the scion on top to actually send out aerial roots, get its roots in the soil, and then it can pick up diseases that way. So with grafted tomatoes, unlike with regular tomatoes where with ungrafted tomatoes, you can plant them deeper in the soil, and that's actually often a good thing because it encourages more roots. But with grafted tomatoes, you don't need to do that. The rootstock is going to be vigorous enough as it is, and you don't want to get the soil anywhere near the scion up here because then it can catch diseases. Be sure to check out all our other videos on gardening tips, tricks, and how-tos. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Happy gardening!